Welcome to the AI innovation space. We are your experts, and I'm Iyanu.
And I'm Todd.
We're here to offer our unique insights and hold conversations with top leading innovators in the world of AI and machine learning.
We dissect and discuss the often complex realm of AI in an accessible way and go deep in discussing the innovative technologies that impact our lives every day.
This podcast is sponsored by Lumen, an IT contractor offering a creative and human-centric approach to medical imaging, cybersecurity solutions, training and support, and more. Lumen's values of ingenuity and connection make us a leader in adopting innovative technologies for federal healthcare and beyond.
Visit Illumin's website at www.illumin.com for an overview of the services offered and to read our blog series on leveraging AI for your business. Thank you so much for listening, and let's begin.
We're super excited to have our guest here with us, but I would like to have my co-host just say hi to everybody. Hi, Todd. How you doing?
Doing great. Thank you, Yana.
You're welcome. Yeah, we're really excited about the conversation today because this is more of an in-house discussion with Alex, and I would have Alex introduce himself. Alex is the creative technologist at Lumen, and we're super excited to have him here. How are you doing, Alex?
Doing great, Iyanu.
Awesome. Do you want to do a short introduction of yourself? Like, who are you? Who is Alex?
Right. No, fair enough. I'm Alex. I am a creative technologist at Lumen. It's kind of a catch-all term, but it means I work in everything from 3D animation, 2D animation to some of our experiments in VR training.
That's super awesome. So with regards to what you do in 2D, 3D, how's that been coming for you? Sure, exciting.
No, it's been really fun. The whole government contract space is really interesting to see what people want in those areas and see. I don't know if it's as mature in the government space as it is in the commercial space. So there's some interesting opportunities to show people things they haven't seen before.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why we're really excited to go into our topics today is, because the goal here is to really help individuals understand how AI, AR, VR topics can help their business, get people interested in this subject because it is emerging. There are still technologies that are still being built. This space, we have things like the metaverse, whatever we call it, and we'd have the opportunity to really begin to dive into some of those topics. But before we get into that, I think we wanted to really hear from you. Can you discuss some of your prior and past work in this space?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a fairly recent graduate. I graduated in 2020, and my major was what I did in college was kind of a smattering of different engineering disciplines, but with an emphasis on design. When I graduated, that was actually probably one of my first experiences with making a substantive AR VR experience. When I graduated, it was first class of the pandemic. We didn't get a graduation, and I had the opportunity to make a virtual reality graduation where I used photos to create a scan of the area on campus where we were going to have a graduation and bring that into kind of tidy up the 3D model that came out of that and bring it into Mozilla Hubs, which is an online platform for collaborative kind of VR meetings. And I was able to bring people from their computers, bring people into that area on campus. So while we were all apart for the actual graduation, sitting on our separate laptops and desktops, a bunch of people were able to join, customize their avatar. Graduates could put a design on their caps and walk around and still kind of meet people. Not the exact same experience, but it was really influential in making me realize kind of the power of some of these VR experiences to bring people together when other options may be limited.
Wow, that was super cool. I'm very interested in how did you thought you were going to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So, one thing I'm interested in that you were saying there is that you had a platform to bring people together in this virtual reality environment. So what kind of headsets were you guys using? What kind of platform were you using? Is it like Teams or some sort of a platform that another company produces?
Right. So that is Mozilla Hubs. And it is, Mozilla does a ton of open source stuff, and they're pushing the boundaries on what I'd say community infrastructure, what that can mean. And so they've made this platform called Hubs, which is web first, web based, but people can join from their desktop or join from the VR headset. And so you can control your character with mouse and keyboard, or join from any like supported VR headset and participate pretty much the same. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like you can use a wide range of headsets available for that Hubs experience.
Definitely. And it's a whole other side tangent, but when the VR industry first was starting to come out, every different company had their own kind of standards, and it was led to a lot of like exclusivity and headsets not working nicely together with different applications. But in recent years, open XR standards, which obviously Mozilla's behind, or Mozilla has a big interest in, made it so that experiences like this, these headsets are built around these common standards now, and more companies are coming behind it. So we're able to create an experience that is deployable across a variety of headsets because these companies came together and realized that they should work together on that.
Sure, makes a lot of sense. So, I'm also interested a little bit on some of your past work with using Unity and, some courses that you might have taken. You discussed that you exposed to this in college. Like, what kind of classes kind of gave you insights into all this virtual reality world?
No, absolutely. Overall, I'd say my degree was focused around, like user experience in a broad definition that can be everything from physical interactions to user interface, or what you might think of in a website. But actually, first semester, freshman year, I took Intro to Virtual Reality, and it was an incredible class talking about the history of VR, which is a lot longer than I think anyone would expect. It's a lot, goes farther back than I think anyone would expect. And then through some research at the time, different things that improve comfort in VR, different things that help us tell distance, a lot of these subtle things about VR experiences that help them feel more real, more comfortable, or kind of augment and take advantage of unique situations that can be presented in VR, present things that don't make logical sense or might not make physical sense, and kind of experiment on the boundaries there.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm very interested in what you had, you started with, being able to create these experiences on like your graduation day and things like that. And I found that to be very, very exciting. I was just wondering, did you take pictures of the location, or was that like a video that you had to take? And then what was it like transforming the picture experience into an actual VR experience?
So luckily there's a process called photogrammetry, and luckily there's some really powerful software that does most of the heavy lifting for that. Really? But for that one, it was an outdoor area. What's up?
What software was that?
Oh yeah, it's Capturing Reality is the name of the software, which is recently purchased, I think, by Epic Games and integrated into their Epic Games, who runs Unreal Engine, as part of their suite of tools. And to do that, I got a drone, a little DJI mini drone, flew around campus, this area over campus, and took 500 photos, sent those into the software, and with enough overlap between the photos, it can figure out the angles those were taken from. Wow. And then rebuild a 3D model and texture it. And so the model that came out of that was, I think, a gigabyte and a half or something, and pretty highly detailed. You could see, like, it was a pretty large outdoor space, but you could zoom in and see texture on some of the bricks and read some of the signs on doors and things like that. It's pretty impressive.
That is super cool. Could such reality, and this would lead to us to our next question, could such reality be moved into other spaces as well? So could we take that same experience, push that into your Unity software or your Unreal Engine software?
Yes. And that reminds me that I missed the Unity part of Todd's question. The Mozilla Hubs experience was all web-based, but then for some of these deployable experiences that I've been working on with Illumin, actually, we've used Unity and are experimenting with Unreal Engine. And both of them are, as game engines, they support these models so I can make a photogrammetry model and then bring it into the engine and have that be the environment that someone participates in. So I can scan that campus, and then even if I was over in like another state wearing a VR headset, with enough fidelity in the model, like it does a pretty good job of like convincing you're in a different space.
That is cool. I think Todd had a question. Todd, you had a question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex, for touching on that Unity project work. So, where would you like to kind of take that next? I mean, what do you think are some cool projects that you could work on with that platform?
That's kind of the fun bit with virtual reality is it nearly feels like it's endless. Uh, to say the least. I've been lucky enough to I myself own the Meta Quest 2 headset as well as the Valve Index. And a big push behind some of these headsets is obviously like gaming versus training. And I've been lucky enough to experience some of Half-Life Alyx is a great game that came out. It's with a really big emphasis on fluid gameplay, like a lot of attention to user experience, and then a brilliant story, brilliant graphics, and experiences like that and some other ones and some other unique interactions in some of these games really start to make you realize that there's ways to make like anything possible, and the technology is only going to get better. So like kind of a broad answer, but there's what can't we do is kind of
Sure,
where I'm
right.
at.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's a room for a lot of different areas and opportunities.
And
So,
as there, yeah,
one thing, Alex, that we hear thrown around a lot are these acronyms and terms: AR, XR, the metaverse. Can you help our audience kind of understand some of these terms and kind of give your definition on what you feel the metaverse really means?
definitely big question right now, and a lot of people are talking about it. As far as like the kind of umbrella term, that for me is XR or extended reality. And overall, there's a lot of talk like about extended reality being kind of a spectrum where like reality's in the center, and then you go far to the right, and that is virtual reality, like completely all simulated or all like augmented, or I didn't mean augmented, all artificial. And then all the way to the left is more of like an augmented reality experience where you're taking, maybe it's pass through, where you're seeing the world around you, but the headset also understands the space you're in and is augmenting that, is adding something into the space with proper occlusion and just making it appear real in your space. So there's a whole range there. XR is that extended reality. That's the shorthand for it. VR, virtual reality, and augmented reality, AR. And mixed reality is kind of in there with augmented reality, MR. And then as far as metaverse, it's one of those terms that is thrown around a lot. And I think there's a lot of companies trying to make their definition the definition. I mean, Meta, even Facebook, even changing getting that parent company name of Meta is a big push to like have their definition, I think, be the right one. But when we're talking about it, I don't think there's any one company that's going to be the metaverse. The metaverse, I think, means the collection of companies that are all going to, when I've talked about it before, talking about social media companies, there is no one social media company, but they all kind of form the social media space. I think that's similar for the metaverse. And actually, some news I heard recently, tons of companies are getting together in this thing called the Metaverse Standards Forum, which includes companies like Adobe, Google, Epic Games, Meta, even companies like IKEA are getting together to decide standards for assets, for some of the interfaces, avatars, making that kind of XR style interaction and standards possible. So it's broad and definition's really fluid right now.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying that the metaverse, in my opinion as well, is likely to be made up of several companies and not just one. I know companies like Meta, the parent of Facebook, might argue otherwise. And I recently saw an interview by Mark Zuckerberg where he was talking about the long-term plans of what Meta's planning to do in the metaverse over the next 10 years. And that sounds like they consider it like $1 trillion opportunity, and there's going to be a lot of money and opportunity to be made there. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops with all these companies over the course of the next decade or so.
Definitely. And I think I'm on the side hoping that it's a little bit more, the metaverse exists a little bit more like the internet does, where it's based, where one company can't control what the internet is. And we'll see, we'll see how these companies choose to manifest their own. I mean, Meta being such a leader in the adoption of VR, making the Quest 2 headset available to everyone, they have a lot of pull, but we'll see how that all lays out, right?
Yep. I agree. Great definitions, and I think that very, very well explained. I think we could definitely segue into some of the ways that you think that AI and VR can overlap or can meet together. And so, what are some of your thoughts around how AR, VR, MR can integrate nicely with AI?
Definitely. And I'm definitely gonna have to get some input from you guys. You guys are the AR ML people. I lean more on the graphic side, but I've seen a ton of news recently about. I mean, the goal with virtual reality and with a lot of this technology is to create experiences, is to create compelling, be it like realistic or fantastical experiences. And and AI can be a huge boon to that, like used correctly, obviously. One of the things I saw, I think it's called GPT-3. There was an implementation, and typically in video games, you walk around, you talk to an NPC, and they have a line that they say, a scripted line where you talk to enough NPCs and you'll hear the same line repeated a couple times because they're not intelligent agents on their own. They may have some places that the game creators tell them to walk or whatnot, but there's not variation between different gameplay sessions. There's not variation. They're scripted. And using an implementation of GPT-3, this one person hooked it up so that you can speak in VR to an NPC. The NPC has some generated aspects to them as far as like who they are, what their name is, maybe what their job is, but you can ask them questions and it takes a second to process, but then it sends that your question or what you said out to GPT-3, gets a response, then has another, I don't even know what it's called. You guys maybe know better than me, but it turns that text response back into speech. I think it's voice synthesis and speaks that back to the player. And so the interaction is definitely slower than in real life. It takes like maybe 10, 15 seconds for the response to come. But it's a new response and it's unique. And it's two people who ask the same question, but are in different instances of the game, may get completely different responses. And that novelty there is something that is only enabled by this AI. Maybe you guys can touch on like how that kind of like communication, that synthetic communication is possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of applications AI in the NLP space where you turn a voice into text and then you do AI analysis on the text and then you transform that or feed that back into the system. And as you were talking, you're speaking about GPT-3 and all that kind of stuff, you might be familiar with the 3 stages of AI, right? Where the hope is that at some point, these systems will be very, very aware of the environment that they're in and able to respond, stuff like that. Do I still think we're still far away from that? But you might have seen the news on Lambda, right? You heard about Lambda, the sentient stuff from Google. Yeah.
Where the engineer claimed that the AI had become sentient.
Yeah. So I think there's a huge push to like make our systems more aware of the environment and being able to respond to that. I don't know if Todd had something else to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I still think, like Yana was saying, that we're a ways off from getting through all the 3 stages of AI and making everything self-aware. I mean, there has been some debate on that Google example if it really is sentient or not. I think Google says it's not. And then the guy who works there claims that it is. But I mean, yeah, overall, I feel like there's definitely a lot of applications and areas that you can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to help improve systems in virtual reality. And I know we're planning to dive into some of those applications here shortly, but there's a whole host of mathematical algorithms and techniques that are behind that will help make that happen. And, those interested, I'm sure you can find papers and publications on the topic. You can look more of the details online.
I think even with current capabilities, like what you're talking about, there's a lot of potential for, I'm going to say, like storytelling experiences, which at some level, I think the best VR training situations are that they're compelling story that you can remember. So I've seen, when you're talking about that, the implementation of some of those natural language processing models to simulate even basic responses where maybe you're trying to, I think, Ianu, did you say the phrase tonal analysis or like sentiment analysis?
Yep.
right, to get immediate feedback to people, to potential like trainees on their tone of voice, like a kind of, I don't want to say like unbiased, but more of an objective, this is what the AI thinks like maybe your tone was. Is that the kind of, with the sentiment analysis stuff, what the
Yep.
output is?
Yep. There are a couple of folks that do that where it would use your facial cues to pick, like, oh, is it tired? Okay, if it's tired, do we serve him a better content? That kind of a thing.
And that's okay. And so you're mentioning like facial interface, like where it
Facial cues. Yeah.
some recording of eye movement, mouth movement, like facial
Yeah.
expression.
Yeah.
Some of that is possible, like with some current headsets, and there's a lot of research in eye tracking. But it's interesting to like some of the lower end or the more entry level headsets don't have a lot of like user facing or like user face feedback, mostly just microphones. So it'd be interesting to see like what kind of sentiment analysis you can do audio alone, right?
I see. I see. Todd, were you going to say something?
So yeah, I guess speaking from a broader sense, or Alex or Yanu, anything else you guys want to share on ways we feel that AI and machine learning can help with virtual reality? Otherwise, I think we have prepared some examples we'd like to share with our audience to kind of dive into.
Yeah. So, I guess some of the areas that needs to still really be explored in this space, and I'm not sure, Alex, if you've touched on it, but devices that are able to like feel people's bodies or that are able to creating experiences that are very close to what they would have if they were physically present with one another. So let's say, for example, I was with you in the VR space and you give me a pat at the back, right? I'd feel the exact same thing on my on my end of the spectrum. Is that something that you're aware of, or is that something that you've done a little bit of research into?
As like individual research, not I haven't had a whole lot of experience with that, but I am fascinated by the whole kind of industry that's springing up around assistive or like immersive tech.
Yeah. The reason why I bring that up is because this could be tremendously helpful for people who are doing physiotherapy, like and stuff like that, that need a little bit of like help or guidance as to like, okay, this is how you move. This is how you get what I'm saying? And literally they're in the VR space, but then they could feel the doctor and stuff like that. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, Yanu. I think virtual reality in conjunction with AI can help create like immersive environments where you can feel like you're actually next to the person, and you could be multiple states or even countries away. And I think it can help in that regard and make that experience more immersive. And there's a whole host of applications and areas that could help in, from gaming that Alex has touched on to healthcare and surgery, numerous applications.
Yeah. Something that I know that like we'll probably touch on when we start talking about applications and then go to some of the issues. Like one of the things that I've really always sort of struggled with is, so you're in the VR space, right? And I haven't found the keyboard experience to be all awesome. But when we start talking about issues, I think we'll bring those up. But Todd, we could definitely move into some of the applications now.
Okay, so one of the things that Yano and I are familiar with, Alex, that Veterans Affairs is interested in this platform called Enterprise Simulation Platform for Learning and Education. And what this platform basically would do, it hasn't fully been created yet. It's like an opportunity that they're soliciting responses on. Is it would help create an environment where you could use artificial intelligence and natural language processing, for example, to help drive video analysis of learner performance. And they want to be able to have like an environment where you feel like you're, in the same room as somebody in another location throughout the whole VA. And it would include like first of kind metrics on angles of video and sound, where the system can watch and identify performance variables. They want to use AI and machine learning to help recognize these nonverbal cues like body languages, change in human physiology, and like facial recognition and audio recognition that AI could help utilize as well. So the whole idea is that they don't feel like like a Microsoft Teams, for example, that I know I use a lot for collaborative work meetings. They don't feel like that has really the capability to create like settings where if you're working remotely and you're trying to simulate like an office environment, for example, and you want like a realistic type of environment where you're immersed and you're like actually feel like you're sharing the same space instead of working in all these different silos. So, what are some of your thoughts around that, Alex?
It's really interesting. I think as I've gotten a little bit deeper into this VR stuff, I do think that the potential for learning and training in VR is huge, in big part because of what you're talking about, the opportunity for feedback, analytics, and data that may not have previously been accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're talking about some of these, like a VR experience, for example, with Illumin, I was just working on a prototype experience for interacting in a warehouse for medical logistics. And what we can do with that is simulate a couple dozen different experiences with slight modifications, and then do it easily without, say, in a real life scenario, having to reset and place and set up scenarios. They're very precisely duplicable. I don't know if that's the word, duplicable, where we can make the same experience manifest a bunch of different times. But then because the entire experience is in a virtual setting, we can track and recreate and exactly what the trainee might be seeing. We can get their hand motions with some other sensors. We could get heart rate tracking with eye tracking inside the headset. We can figure out what objects they're focusing on. We can track to like the millisecond how long it takes someone to complete a task. We can get kind of like if they're looking back and forth trying to figure out what the next objective is. I'm betting that we could train models to interpret those kind of body physical feedback as disorientation or confusion, right? And we can, I guess all I'm trying to say is like with everything being virtual, there's so much more quantitative numbers and data that we have access to that we can run through some of these models to get some really interesting insights, if that makes any sense.
Definitely. I agree. One other aspect that in relation to this that I thought was interesting, this veterans simulation platform for learning education, is they talked about the possibility of using the STEAM engine and 3D Max software to stand up virtual spaces for modeling items in a facility. I know one thing that you've looked at, Alex, is the Unreal Engine and using like death cameras and scanners. iPhone integration. I mean, how do you think that might play into all this platform for learning and education?
The tools to create content in 3D are becoming infinitely more accessible. And we're talking about from the game engine side, we have Unity, which is free, and Unreal Engine, which is free up to a certain point, like where you actually make some level of profit with it. And they have some other like licensing models. But what you're saying with the iPhone, I myself haven't always been like an Apple person, but their iPad, but I have the iPad Pro with a Face ID camera and the LiDAR scanner on the back. And Face ID, which is mainly touted as a security feature, is a 3D scanner, a high quality front facing 3D scanner. And there are some apps, Apple allows access to the information from, it's like a depth camera. And there's some apps where you can do a 3D scan of your face or do a detailed 3D scan of some objects just using the iPad. And then on the backside, in a lot of recent models, they've added the LiDAR sensor. And that's light detection and ranging. I think that's what that is. And their main push for that is augmented reality, where you can show kind of pass through of the camera on the iPad and have proper occlusion of objects. So if you're adding a 3D model to the scene, but it's like behind the couch or something, or cut off a little bit by the couch, it adds to the realism because the couch, using the information from the LiDAR scanner, it can overlay the couch over the 3D model in like a proper 3D way. But these are like consumer level devices. And while not everyone's going out there and using their iPad to scan 3D objects like I am, these are all accessible and can produce a high enough quality scan of objects or some rooms that the cost to get into this area is drastically reduced. The tools are available. And I think it's really exciting to see as more and more people get their hands on it, how people can create content for this without it having to be some major studio.
Yeah, I definitely see what you're getting at there. It sounds like a lot of this is already accessible because a lot of people own these Apple devices that have these LiDAR scans and ability to scan a 3D scan of the face. And it's just a matter of them being aware of this and integrating it with some platform available that may be able to make this more accessible to them. So it sounds like you think that, having wide use of virtual reality or augmented reality may be coming sooner than people may think.
I'm kind of betting on it, but I think that you're right on with that.
Do you have anything you want to add to this discussion, Yana?
Oh, no. I'm enjoying what we're discussing here. And I really think that as we even move to the second application on Brian and what some of what he's been working on with his group, Aurora AI, and how to use this, I guess, tool to advance or increase the learning for students. I think from training to the educational space where you have young folks sometimes struggling to pay attention, and just how AR and VR can be a way of sort of mixing play with learning and stuff. So I'm excited about what we're discussing, Todd.
Sure. Yeah. So just if anyone missed our previous podcast, we did have a prior episode with Brian Talibi at Aurora AI that Yanu mentioned, and he was very interested in, and his company is interested in using AI to help improve learner and educational experiences. And so that kind of ties into what we just talked about with the Veterans Affairs being interested in a virtual reality, augmented reality type approach. And it sounds like it has a lot of applications to help improve education and people's ability to comprehend information.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of that phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. From what I understand about what Brian's doing, input from the camera, input from success on different lessons and completion, and anything that they can quantify out of that experience, feeding that into like recommendation engines or kind of optimize the learning experience. And I think AR, VR just adds another layer, another set of potential inputs into that process.
Yeah, I completely agree, Alex. It definitely would help take it to a further step and even go further than just a simple camera. So one other topic that we wanted to touch on here, I know we're interested in this, Alex, because we look a lot in the healthcare space, is there's these HoloLenses that surgeons are now using to help primarily with like simulation training before they're actually doing the surgery. But there was recently an article where some surgeons at the Virginia Spine Institute used a combination of AI and augmented reality to deliver personalized spinal implants to a teenage patient. And it allowed them to tailor it to the patient's anatomy and help match it on an AI-driven preoperative surgical plan that was allowing the surgeons to precisely align the spine and help reduce the need for additional surgeries in the future. And so they use these HoloLens goggles to have augmented reality help guide them while they were undertaking the surgery, and it allowed, accurate position of the tools and allowed it to be a success. So just kind of interested in if you have any experience with the HoloLens or any thoughts on, using augmented reality to help with surgeries.
It's definitely the whole surgery aspect it's a very compelling use case, especially because anything that we can do to like improve outcomes in healthcare stuff is obviously awesome. The HoloLens is a really interesting headset and a really interesting area because I used the HoloLens 1 when I was in college, and I can't remember I don't think I've had the opportunity to use the HoloLens 2 yet, but it is an augmented reality device / like a mixed reality device. And for anyone who doesn't know, it is I'm going to call it like a futuristic thick pair of sunglasses. And when you look through it, it does outward facing cameras that can capture the environment. It can understand where it is in 3D space, can understand where some objects are in your room, and some analysis or identification of those objects to make them maybe like context dependent or context aware tooltips or prompts or things like that. So in the case of the surgery, you're looking through these I'm going to call them just sunglasses, and there's a small window that appears to be like maybe kind of the size of a screen of like a normal computer monitor if you're like leaning back in your chair. That is the augmented reality area. And within that, it is overlaying images that appear to be like farther away than they are. And so when the surgeon's looking at the patient, I read that article too, but I didn't see any specific like scenes or examples of what it actually looked like to them. But I have to imagine they're looking at the patient as they're doing the surgery, and the patient's obviously immobilized, and they were correcting, was it like a 90-degree bend in the spine? Is that right?
Yeah, I believe so. And I think you're accurate that they were looking through it while they were doing the surgery to help guide them.
Right. And so based off of, with the input from MRI scans or whatever scans they did, they're able to show where each spinal bone would be. And I think the interesting aspect of those MR devices is it's kind of manifesting the mind's eye, where I'm sure these top surgeons have a very, very good understanding and intuition for 3D space and have completed these surgeries without the assistance of these headsets. But it's kind of, I'd imagine that their intuition going in here into those surgeries, they're intuitively know where some of these bones are and like where they need to move them, and they have an idea. But with the allowed tracking of these headsets, they're able to precisely align. And I'd be really curious to know, I didn't see a whole lot in the article about how they got input from the surgery in progress back to the headset. Because it's easy enough to do an MRI scan and then overlay that 3D model back on to this person. But as they're moving the bones and readjusting the spine during surgery, really curious how they get that feedback back to the headset so that the surgeons have an accurate, a kind of like almost X-ray vision of able to see where they're moving things around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, the article didn't have too many details, but it definitely would be interesting to know some more specifics on how that was working.
Bottom line was that surgeons thought it was helpful and leads to better patient outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm, for sure. I was just gonna also mention there was another example of using augmented reality in the healthcare for surgeons that recently came across as well. Due to COVID-19, a lot of patients were being seen with less staff than previously because they were reducing the amount of people that could conjugate in one area. And so there are these medical proctors that formerly were in the OR with the surgeon, and they would highlight with like a laser pointer items on the screen for the doctor to look at while they're doing the surgery. And so recently, they started to use augmented reality technology to allow these medical device reps to point with a laser virtually, remotely to guide the surgeon. So basically what happens is the medical proctors draw on an image, and then they share their screen and warn the doctors what to look for. And these solutions were incorporating, artificial intelligence and computer vision to help aid the surgeon and the ability to know what to look for with their surgery. So just wanted to mention that. Not sure if you guys have any quick thoughts on that particular topic.
I think it's a great example. I can imagine that contamination, and the more people you have in an operating room or in the middle of a surgery, I can imagine that there's more risk, any chance that we can get the same or even an improved level of assistance if the medical rep can see through like the doctor's eyes almost and point them directly to where they're trying to go. I think that's awesome. That's huge.
Yeah, there's always been this desire for doctors to be able to do their surgeries without having to cut people's skin. So I'm aware of someone who had surgery a couple weeks back, and basically they would typically stick this glue on the skin with the idea that it closes up the wound so that the patient, I guess, doesn't develop like a hernia or something, right? And so anything that allows the doctor to be able to go right to where the issues are and address those, concerns directly, I think it's going to be a huge win, right? Stuff like that, because there are other complications that get developed from having to navigate through different paths to get to the exact location on what you're trying to treat. And we're seeing some of these advancements in eye surgeries. So, yep.
For sure. And, just keeping it on surgery for another minute here, one other area that I'd be interested to get your thoughts on, Alex, is we're interested in these hepatic gloves that surgeons are using primarily for training right now that can allow them to get some additional sense of touch to help them during surgery and identifying key areas of surgery that they can feel with these gloves. So do you have anything you can share on gloves or hand or body tracking?
I think that the two biggest sides of, I'm going to say any system, but this VR experience overall is like that input output. And the experience becomes that much more real the more we're able to output, the more senses we're able to take advantage of. Like definitely VR is primarily a visual experience right now, but then vibrations and controller haptics try to emulate some of that. So I think in games, and the most common form is vibrations in the controllers. In like an archery game, you use your controllers and you notch the arrow on the bow, and as you pull it back, the controller like vibrates a little bit, kind of like to give you this idea of pulling the bow back and some tension being there. And then you let it go, and you feel like a little click in that hand where you let it go. But that's kind of like the lowest end, all the way up to, I don't even know the specific names of some of these companies. I've just seen their products where it's a full glove that slips over your hand, and there's an air compressor that runs to it. And through what I can only imagine is a very complicated system, they have micro bubbles, like little air pockets all over the fingers that it's kind of an array. Imagine it like an array of pixels, but it's an array of little air pockets. And through like rapidly changing like the pressure in those air pockets, they can simulate different textures. So while the glove and the hand is tracked and the motion is tracked, there are some experiences where you can like glide your hand across a surface and feel the texture of leather, or feel the texture of feel something soft where it's like a little bit more pliable. Even past the texture side, there are kind of like motion limiting handsets or hand controllers where you can reach out and grab a box in VR. Normally, there's no resistance, but these handsets, I don't know if handset's the right word, I keep using it, but you reach out and you grab the box, and the glove limits how much your fingers can contract. Usually it's by little cups on the tips of your fingers that are rigged to kind of like an interface on the back of your hand that stop your fingers from gripping anymore. Actually, something just interesting about this area overall is how much work your brain already does just by default to make those experiences feel real. So even if it's not a direct, exact simulation of what that would feel like, a lot of people that use these kind of things report how it feels right. Like it may not be, you're not actually touching that texture, or some other ones where you're touching like different temperatures. But the brain does a lot when you give it the visual stimulus and even an inkling of the physical stimulus to fill in the gaps. I'd imagine that the precision of that is a huge issue, though, when we're talking about this like surgery stuff, where you'd need appropriate and predictable feedback for the surgeon's hands if they're going to be trying any of this stuff, right?
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree that there's probably a balance on what the amount is on the touch and the feel, but it definitely could help in surgery and these other areas that you mentioned to improve applications and areas.
Definitely an area that is currently being explored, and along the lines of what we were talking about before, with standards there, I've seen some recent arguments that we need some standards for those kind of interfaces, because there's a lot of companies developing different drivers, different input methods for those that are not interoperable with each other. And so making some kind of standards where, I don't know if it's like finger pressure, there's a million different variables to keep track of, but making some of those interfaces more standardized could lead to some broader adoption and innovation in those areas.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Standardization usually can help. So you have various companies and players in the field making things that everyone is comfortable using and has some interoperability. So, one other topic that we're interested in here, Alex, is kind of your knowledge on these virtual reality training treadmills. I know that some soldiers and military personnel are using them to help prepare for the battlefield. Do you have any insight on these virtual reality treadmills?
It's the industry is just as broad as the gloves. I don't know. I'd say they're probably pretty comparable.
Mm-hmm.
There's consumer level ones where I think like one on the lower end, I think it's called the Catwalk VR is one that I've seen, is in the like $500, $600 to $1,000 range, all the way up to like obviously multi-million dollar, maybe even billion-dollar companies working on larger deck platforms. And those walking can be everything from a set of really slippery socks, and will kind of like, it relies on you stepping and then sliding back to the center. Some of those decks where like they restrain you in the center, to, have you guys seen Ready Player One?
Yes.
Yanu?
No, no.
To be honest, I haven't actually seen it. I've seen clips of it. Right. I need to actually get on it. But I have seen about the treadmill they use in there, which is a multi-directional treadmill, and it can, imagine it like a typical treadmill, but it can run in both axes and then vary the speed on each axis. So you can run on it, and its whole objective is to move you back to the center, align you back to the center. There's a big issue with that overall, is just how do you harness a person? How do you, when you fall in VR, you're falling in real life. And so there's a lot of issues with how to keep someone vertical without taking away too much from the experience, how to allow them to crouch, allow them to jump, depending on what the situation involves. It's so crazy because with every one of these components, we're talking hands, we're talking headsets, we're talking omnidirectional treadmills, haptic vests. It is like a Herculean task, every one of these, to try and bring something that satisfies like an ever-changing like bill of requirements. All these companies are doing, and everyone's got a different idea of how to do it. But it's a really exciting, I think all of this is a really exciting space to be in right now, because there's so many moving parts and so many people creating otherworldly or just like standout experiences that just change your perception of what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. As you were talking, in my mind, I was like, with regards to like people falling or simulating, having the VR experience where you're actually falling in the VR space, but then at the same time, you're falling in real life. I'm thinking to myself, are there like spaces or spaces being created where essentially you go into this maybe little room you can purchase and then you could jump up, hit your head on the wall, and you still be fine, type of deal. So you can still sort of enjoy the experience as opposed to getting hurt.
No, definitely. No, my visual for that is I'm just imagining like those like movie style psych ward thing, padded room. What I have seen as far as like physical spaces, definitely a lot in the commercial space. There's a lot in Vegas. I can't even remember the name of the company, but they have kind of a big, I didn't actually go into it, but like a big black room, and they have a couple different like walls or obstacles in that room. It's all like untextured. It's just like simple shapes, but then it's a VR experience location, and they give everyone VR headsets, and they use the same layout of the room, but style it different for every experience. So what may just be a big black room in real life, there's like a Star Wars experience where they use the same dimensions of the real room. So you can lean on walls in that space where you can't lean on walls in an experience at home. They can create like I don't know, it's like a Star Wars spaceship hangar, and you can lean against the wall or peek around the corner to like shoot some stormtroopers. And then they make like that exact same room, but textured and visually looks completely different in the headset for like, I don't know, like a Raiders of the Lost Ark, like kind of adventurer situation. So there are some rooms that kind of play off of that, but then it's limiting in the way where when you set the location, where you set all of your physical walls and boundaries and obstacles, you have to build around that. And you're able to change the visuals to a degree. There's so many things to balance with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Definitely interesting. So one other thing that we wanted to get in here too, regarding applications with virtual reality and artificial intelligence, is we wanted to talk a little bit more about the metaverse. There's several areas that I'm aware of that you can use artificial intelligence in conjunction with virtual reality and the metaverse. So one of them is on avatar creation. And AI can, help be used in conjunction with 3D scans that are taken of someone to create an avatar that would have accurate facial expressions, emotions, hairstyles, and, basically look like the person in a realistic manner. Another one is it can help expand the virtual worlds that you're using in the metaverse. You can use historical data in conjunction with like a learning algorithm to help learn from the previous outputs and come up with a new virtual world. And there's also this possibility of having AI-enabled headsets can be used in conjunction with sensors on them to help make predictions based on things like the electrical and muscular patterns of where someone might want to move without them actually moving. You could see the AI helping to augment that VR headset in that manner. So, I'm just throwing some thoughts out here on the metaverse and AI and VR. Any comments or thoughts on any of that, Alex?
Avatars is a whole other deep rabbit hole. The whole idea of trying to recreate believable, realistic people. And as we're trying to make VR more realistic, diving into that in a whole different way. Facebook has been doing a lot of research on that. Meta, a couple of years ago, I saw they used a massive photogrammetry rig, which is that cameras to 3D model process, to capture highly detailed models of people's faces and train algorithms to be able to recreate that face in 3D. And when that same person is wearing a VR headset and you give them eye tracking and some cameras focused on their mouths, how they're moving, it's able to create a virtual representation of them that looks as if they're not wearing a headset and looks pretty believable. And I think I sent you guys this video a week or two ago, where their most recent iteration of that is, instead of having to get someone out to their massive location where they're this established photogrammetry setup, that same Apple Face ID depth camera, you can do a scan with that in 10 minutes. Send the processing time still takes a little bit. It takes, I think, something like 6 hours, but it can spit back out a realistic 3D model of your face that can move like and work in virtual reality. And that is insane. It's one of the coolest things I've seen. Video is definitely super interesting. But on my end, I love the output, right? I love being able to see this realistic avatar. But how are they doing that? How are they they're blending between different emotions. They're interpolating between different facial expressions. They're able to copy one person's emotions onto another face. You guys had a chance to see that video, right? Do you have any insight into what they're doing as far as AI ML in that process?
Yeah, I mean, we saw the video. It looked very interesting. They had some algorithms that they were using that they described in the video that were allowing them to do that. But it definitely looked very realistic, for sure. I mean, I was really blown away that you could do all that from just a phone scan.
For what I understand, it's like trained from as much as the video reveals, using that research that they did a couple of years ago with all the photogrammetry cameras, they're able to take data from this expensive and maybe like cost prohibitive setup for a consumer and use insights and models learned from that on the consumer devices. Then I think you mentioned also, do you want to talk about the NVIDIA instant nerf thing? Did you guys have a chance to look at that?
briefly, what do you want to talk about that a bit? I think it was using 2D photos to create a 3D scene. So that kind of is what I mentioned earlier about expanding the virtual worlds in the metaverse, right?
Right. Photogrammetry creates a point cloud. So it creates all these points in 3D space and then is able to create a mesh, a 3D like representation of that with triangles and like some simple geometry. NVIDIA is working on a technique called, I can't even remember what it stands for now, but it's like resonance fields. Using a couple images, they are able to create, or they're calling them neural rendering models. Animations, what they do is they do like keyframes where they're like specific, like high importance poses or something. And they'll draw those out and then they'll draw the tween frames. And that just creates kind of like a smooth motion. And what this NERF model that they're doing is using a couple photos, it can create unique, like novel perspectives of the same scene just using information from that. And in the article, they have a really good explanation for it where it says most 3D models are kind of like SVGs, like scalable vector graphics are, where they are precise, like 3D models with like strict geometric definitions. And these NERF models are a little bit closer to kind of like JPEGs or bitmap images where I don't want to say it's like less precise, but it is, I can't think of the right term for it, but what they're doing is incredible because they're using just a couple of photos to generate novel views of objects and quickly too. The reason this thing is called instant NERF, NERF, is they're able to do it in seconds. And where these photogrammetry scans may take a couple hours to process, if this is where we're headed with 3D scanning and the level of fidelity they're able to create, it's so big that I can't even imagine what's possible next. This is going to create.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, one thing they talk about in the article from NVIDIA is they're using neural networks to be able to create these realistic 3D scenes. And it's very interesting that this neural network can allow you to basically fill in the blanks around like occlusions if you're missing some objects even in the images. And in order to get to the speed that you're talking about, they're using these NVIDIA GPUs, which are graphic processing units, to help speed up the training and the rendering of these 3D scenes.
Right. And like do you know if they're doing, is it kind of like commercial level GPUs or if they're like using a big rendering farm to get this done? As far as I could tell, it can be even done on little like commercial ones.
Yeah, I believe it's ones that you purchase directly from NVIDIA for commercial purposes.
Right. And I think they have this available for like poking around with on GitHub, like where you can download on your own machine and test out, like see if you can make your own NERFs. I've been meaning to do that. Probably get on it after this call sometime.
Yeah, and then the last point I had mentioned earlier in the metaverse was these AI-enabled virtual reality headsets that could help make predictions. Any thoughts on that, Alex?
It's really interesting when we get into that comfort bit that we're going to talk about, comfort in VR headsets. There's not a lot of situations where I'd imagine a VR headset predicting your motion as being incredibly helpful. I could see it in the example I'm thinking of is we don't want the headset to move you without you moving. It can be really disorienting for people. But the situation that you're making me think of now is, say, someone who has limited mobility in their real physical body, a headset that was able to interpret intent could give them the opportunity to walk around in a virtual area, to experience something that physical constraints or physical limitations may prohibit them otherwise. Imagine if someone who was paralyzed was able to put on a VR headset and go walk around with like friends and family in some like purpose-built experience using biometric feedback. There are some groups experimenting with like brain-computer interfaces that work with headsets. You could do some really interesting stuff there with enabling experiences, getting at that core bit of like intent, and maybe even bridging that also into communication. People who are limited in their ability to communicate verbally, if you can interpret intent and maybe create this virtual world or this simulation where they're able to, I'd hope at least that could be a really like empowering experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's a lot of research that's been done, even outside of virtual reality on using signals to help direct implants and prosthesis and things of that nature that patients can use to help move. And I think there's a lot of applications of using that also in this virtual reality environment that could really make big impact on, people's lives who have limited mobility to be able to experience that themselves, virtually in this immersive environment.
Whole lot of potential there.
And I think this is a good segue into, one other area we wanted to get your thoughts on, Alex, which is regarding, a lot of these issues that people complain about, like with the headset being too heavy or having a lot of cables and peripherals that you have to kind of work around when you're using it. Any thoughts or comments on that?
No, that's huge. It's what I think right now about people complaining about cables and some of the headset weight. The thought that just came to my mind is one of the first VR headsets was called I think they called it Sword of Damocles. And it was a ceiling mounted headset on an arm that could only display like simple vector graphics, where like you couldn't really like walk around with it all that much. We've made a lot of progress is what I mean to say, but there's also plenty to go. I was most familiar with using cabled headsets like the Valve Index, and then I tried out the Meta Quest 2, which is a standalone wireless headset. And I was really surprised how dramatic that difference is. You don't feel a cable. You are free to roam around. It really is an incredible experience. As far as headset weight, that is something that all these companies are trying to figure out ways to, it's kind of like it's balancing pros and cons. The lenses in most of these headsets right now are called Fresnel lenses. And they were created actually for lighthouses when lighthouses got too big and they couldn't make monolithic glass lenses that like they'd be too heavy, too unwieldy. Fresnel lenses kind of split up that optics into a bunch of concentric rings, and it makes the whole lens lighter and thinner. And a lot of these headsets then, it's funny that was invented for lighthouses and now it's ended up being used in VR headsets. But while it makes the lenses lighter, there are other like optical distortions that introduces that you have to compensate for in software. If a headset becomes standalone, then you have to worry about battery weight and balancing battery weight with overall playtime, like length that you're able to experience there. And then it's balance of the headset. If you add a battery to the front of the headset, or do you make the strap thicker on the back and add a battery there? Every company right now developing headsets is grappling with these issues of ergonomics, but we're making huge strides towards like some really comfortable experiences.
That's awesome. I also had a couple of questions around rendering. So like you want to render something you built in Unity, for example, right? Like,
yes.
Have you found it to have does it render fast or is it pretty slow? When you do have the video, or if you were creating sort of something like a video and you wanted to download it on your system, is it high gigabytes? Like does it have really crazy amount of gigs? How does that work?
Right. It's all over the spectrum with PC VR titles, like cabled headsets, or you're able to handle a lot more data and you're able to offload the work to, kind of a equipment that would not be possible to fit into a standalone headset. So definitely hardware dependent, how that experience manifests. But even on standalone headsets like the Meta Quest 2, they've introduced some even experimental features for up to 120 hertz refresh rate, 120 frames per second, which is a huge leap for like reducing disorientation and discomfort in VR. The more frames per second that you can get in there, the more realistic, the less kind of like motion disparity between motion in the headset versus like what you experience and what your inner ear tells you. And then as far as rendering, the engines like Unity and Unreal really abstract a lot of that away. If you're doing some complicated stuff with certain materials that you want to emulate, again, depending on the hardware that you want to target, you have to make different sacrifices. Like in some of the mobile experiences, shadows are another render pass that if you really want shadows, it comes at the cost of frames per second, which comes at the cost of increased disorientation and maybe like a less comfortable experience. So developers have to make choices. Like for the warehouse prototype that I worked on, no shadows, but you're able to use different graphics tricks to give the feeling of shadows.
I see.
Where baking in lighting in the scene, where we don't have any dynamic lights that have to be like constantly recalculated, but we're baking that into the textures. And there's a whole bunch of considerations that you can do there. But luckily, the engines like Unity, Unreal really do take care of a lot of the heavy lifting as far as rendering. As just a brief side note, Unreal Engine's doing some really interesting stuff with these kind of graphics optimizations in specific. They haven't quite carried over into VR yet, but with their release of Unreal Engine 5, they're working on a lot of stuff with, it's called geometry virtualization, allowing more polygons to be in the scene, but without taking like too substantial performance hit. And then global illumination, like dynamic global illumination of different scenes. They have a system called Lumen that isn't quite as expensive as ray tracing, like following individual rays of light, but can simulate those experiences and make it all adds to the fidelity. And Unreal is doing some really interesting stuff on that right now.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Todd, do you have a question? I was about to get us to start wrapping up here.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up before we wrap up regarding what you were talking about a little bit on the refresh rate trade-offs. Have you ever experienced any sort of a migraine or headache, or is that kind of related to that discussion around the refresh rate and what you're talking about a bit earlier with the frame rate?
No, it's really interesting. When I first started using VR headsets, some of the first ones that I used were some of the first like cable PC ones, like the original Oculus Rift and HTC Vive. And those had already put a decent emphasis on frame rate. But I think some of the first ones were the mobile phone VR headsets, where it was you strap your phone into a couple lenses and attach it to your face. And I think some of those might have spoiled some people's perceptions of what VR can be, because they were doing the best with the hardware that they had. And I think some people that try some modern headsets, especially like Quest 2, continues to blow my expectations away with like what is possible on a mobile processor. There's been a lot of leaps and strides towards more comfortable VR experiences. That said, I think one of the biggest issues is moving in VR, is just navigating around locomotion. And there's different options like teleportation, where you use a controller and point to a spot across the room. And then as soon as you release the trigger or release the button, you teleport to that position and your headset briefly dips to black. And that's like teleportation movement. And you need some of these locomotion methods for spaces that don't quite fit, like a warehouse that is bigger than the room you're currently playing in. You have to use some of these locomotion methods to get to different areas that you couldn't just walk to. But then the other one that's kind of more disorienting is slide locomotion or smooth locomotion, where you use a stick on the controller and slide forward, like where you put the stick forward and the game kind of moves you forward smoothly. And that can be something that's really difficult to get used to. And I was actually talking to one of my friends who is a AR VR prototype engineer at Apple. And we were talking just about our experience with VR games. And he'd asked me how long it took me to get over that VR motion sickness, because it's such a known experience where the first couple times you try slide locomotion, it's something that you actually like have to build up a little bit of a resistance to, or a tolerance for. And so now I'm at the point where I can like do extended play sessions with that smooth locomotion, but it's interesting that you kind of have to build up a tolerance for that. That said, you can totally skip around that kind of tolerance with other optimizations in games, or prioritizing teleportation locomotion, or experiences that take place kind of stationary or sitting. There's a lot of ways to get around it, but a lot of interesting work in making those experiences comfortable.
I see. Well, yeah, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on that. And hopefully the technology will continue to improve to make virtual reality more comfortable for people going forward.
No doubt about it, right?
So we really appreciate you taking the time, Alex, and sharing with our audience more about virtual reality, augmented reality, and in relation with artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Anything you want to add here, Yanu?
Yeah. Really exciting conversation. Alex, it was good having you. We know that this would be something of interest to our audience, and maybe probably in the future, we're looking forward to having you back.
Definitely appreciate it.
Awesome. All righty. Thank you all for joining another edition of our podcast. We are looking forward to talking to you soon. Bye, everyone.
This has been the AI Innovation Space, sponsored by Illumin. Thanks so much for listening.
Be sure to connect with us through LinkedIn and the Illumin website to learn more about how AI and emerging technology can help you. Also, be on the lookout for our next episode coming soon. Thank you so much for joining us.